Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies webinar on human security in an evolving global landscape. We are still not out of the worst of the pandemic of the last 200 years, with probably more death than the Spanish flu, despite all the progress humanity has made on medical research and medicine over the last 100 years. We just are witnessing one of the bloodiest wars on the European continent since the Second World War. The number of violent conflicts is at its highest in 20 years. Very rapid acceleration of natural disaster with flood, drought, fires, tornadoes, in very big part linked to climate change. And we see also economic inequalities increasing in most of the countries in the world. We can say one thing surely is that human insecurity have actually increased over this century. A report from the UNDP has just come out on this topic called New Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene. And this report will serve as a base for many of our discussion today. We have a very strong panel of discussants to explore this topic of human security. And I would like very briefly to introduce them. You will find their full bio on the website of IISS. Dr. Adriana Denure is a social scientist, co-founder and executive director of the Plataforma CIPÓ. She's a member of the UN Committee on the Development Policies and on the Committee on Global Climate Policies. We have Dr. Greg Austin who leads the IISS Cyberspace and Future Conflict Program. And before joining IISS, Dr. Austin was a professor at the University of New South Wales. We have Sarah Cliffe, who's the director of the New York University Center on International Cooperation. She was the special representative for the World Bank Development Report on Conflict, Security and Development, and a special advisor and assistant secretary general of civilian capacity at the UN. We have Pedro Conceição, who's the director of the Human Development Report at UNDP, lead author of the Human Development Report, and also was the lead author of the Human Security in Anthropocene report. He has published on many other topics. And we have Dr. Des Gasper, who's Professor Emeritus at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and has been very closely associated with the development of the human security concepts over the last years. And myself, Alexander Mark, I'm very honored to have been invited to moderate this high-level panel. And I'm an associate fellow at IISS for conflict, security and development. And I was also before a fellow at Brookings and then the chief specialist for conflict, fragility and violence at the World Bank for 8 years. So I would suggest that we take this seminar in two parts. The first part, I suggest we explore the concepts of human security and how it has evolved. For about 45 minutes, and we try to discuss also his relevance for policy making. And then the second part, we will discuss the responses to increased human insecurity, and in particular, this new concepts that UNDP has brought in their report of solidarity, and how this concept applies today in a world where there's also a lot of challenges to solidarity. So for the one participating in this seminar who have questions, I will ask you to put them in writing. It's going to be very difficult to put all the questions live because of the many panelists we have. And I will also ask the panelists in the second part of the discussion to basically raise their hand if they want to to come in the discussion. We'll try to do the second part of the seminar much more like a discussion. So I will start by asking Dr. Des Gasper, who's been working on this concept, as I mentioned, of human security for a long time, to give you a sort of idea about how it has evolved and how important it is for policymakers. So Dr. Gaspers, Des Gaspers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandre. And thank you, IISS, for this opportunity. I'm going to use a PowerPoint to try and cover some territory quickly as background then to the new report from UNDP. Human security as an explicit concept we can see as a United Nations language. And in this slide, I refer to sort of 6 steps. There's a prehistory, the 1940s response to the global crises of war, leading to foundation of the United Nations. And within the UN Charter and other statements of the time, you see the elements of human security thinking, the interconnections between peace, development, and human rights. Then a second stage of prehistory, we could say, is in the 1980s, in particular in this commissions led by Brandt, Palmer, and Brundtland, not least the Palmer Commission on Common Security, the idea that no country can be secure if its major coexisting countries are insecure or made insecure by its own attempts at security. Also relevant in parallel, through the 1980s, work in the UN system on famine and hunger refined various of the tools which evolved into the human security toolkit, led by, amongst others, Amartya Sen, and a 1989 book called Hunger and Public Action is still a very powerful statement of the conception. Then in explicit form, 4 steps. 1994 Human Development Report from UNDP's Human Development Report Office, building on some previous small steps. And there's a 1993 report, there's work from the Secretary General Boutros-Ghali, in the period of end of the Cold War and reflection on security of what, and the advocacy of a focus on security of people for its own sake and also for its implications for sustainable peace. Second step, a decade later, the Human Security Now report from a UN-commissioned commission led by Ogata and Sen, which advocated empowerment in partnership with protection as the fundamental means towards human security. Third step, again about a decade later, the 2012 General Assembly resolution, after years of discussion, debate, negotiation, because any language has connotations, has supporters and opponents. So it took a decade, but a resolution was adopted by the UN and legitimates the work of, for example, the Human Security Unit and related activities. And then this year, a fourth major step, or potentially major step, the special report from the Human Development Report Office, adding also the emphasis on solidarity, which we're here to discuss today. Human security thinking covers a whole set of levels, and I've tried to distinguish four here. You see them all in the General Assembly resolution of 2012. It's worth distinguishing because they're linked, but they are significantly different, and yet different ones are invoked in different contexts. So there's the concept of security of the person, and that can be treated in broader and narrower ways about the range of values in people's lives which are being secured. Can also be treated at the level of humanity as a whole, as in some of the work on human security. And it has both objective and subjective variants, in quotation marks, according to who is making the judgments of security and security of what. And over time, it's become more and more evident that both of these are essential, and that the terms also are potentially misleading. Then secondly, there's work on intellectual frameworks that try to illuminate and promote achievement of this norm, this goal. I won't go into elements in any detail. You'll see a brief sketch in the General Assembly Resolution of 2012. But apart from these models, frameworks, or general approaches, we can distinguish what we can call a policy philosophy or policy orientation. You'll see it articulated strongly in the Human Security Now report of 2003, with principles of precaution, prevention, protection, empowerment, common security, that one cannot be secure if one's major, if neighbors, partners, trading partners, whatever, are insecure, and especially if they become insecure through one's attempts at security. And the foundational principle in the UN system of the complementarity of peace, development, and human rights. So, third level as a policy philosophy. And then fourthly, there are various planning formats, and also particular tools. So some are packaged work formats. You'll find them in manuals from the Human Security Unit, NGOs such as GPAC, and you'll also see, though I would say more important, because human security is not just a tidy package to be reduced to a single work format, but the use of all sorts of relevant tools of risk mapping, human security indices, perception surveys, and so on. Overall, these elements have arguably roles of trying to bridge across multiple sectors, of trying to give attention to interconnection, and correspondingly of community, of groups that affect each other and have a shared fate, of understanding related to interconnectedness, vulnerabilities, and in some cases breakpoints, and also the attention to subjectivities with security. What is vitally important is connected to people's feelings. Their response depends on their perceptions and their subjectivities. Here's an example of a work format. It's in the Human Development Report Office's own guidance note on human security. Just a simple checklist, really, of types of question, but starting from the key thing, whose security, and in emphasizing the security of ordinary people and of different groups of ordinary people. I'll pass over that quickly. Here's an indication of some of the themes in the policy philosophy, trying to move from situation of narrowly focused attention, which corresponds to narrow awareness of interconnection and of vulnerability. And both of these contribute to narrow sympathies and concerns and commitment. And the policy philosophy thrust in human security thinking is to move to broader attention and thus broader awareness of interconnections, impacts, fragilities, and broader sympathies, concern, generosity, empathy. Lastly, an indication of some of the range of work, which is extensive, from conventional conflict-related security fields, highlighted, for example, in that Routledge Handbook, through natural disasters, through comprehensive reviews at country level of the threats as perceived by experts, as perceived by local people, gender studies, both in UN circles, so in many national human development reports, regional human development reports, also NGO work, such as here from Empowerment and Protection work of GPAC, a conflict-oriented NGO network, and work in fields of climate change, migration, and more. And now, lastly, we have quite a lot of scattered work across many sectors, many centers, and within the UN system itself, the work on human security in the Human Security Unit and related field groups has a life of its own, not that strongly connected to date with the work of the Human Development Reports or the work on human rights, let alone beyond the world of the UN. But at the same time, there is, at least in many locations, increasing awareness of the interaction of threats across many sectors. And this is background to the new report from the Human Development Report Office, which is part of, it's not a one-off also, it's part of its multi-year activity. So there was a 2020 Human Development Report as a prelude to this special report on human security, 2020 report on human development in the Anthropocene. And I understand that both those reports will be extended in the forthcoming 2022 Human Development Report. That's my presentation. Back to you, Alexandre.
Thank you very much. So you gave us a very nice bird view about both the theories, but also how far the concept is going in the UN and further than the UN, actually, in terms of influencing the thinking. So now I would like to move a little bit more towards the sort of policy relevance of these concepts and how today, with all the issues we've discussed at the beginning, these concepts becomes really urgent to implement. So my first question will go to Pedro Conceição, and who directed the preparation of this report, to see a little bit what's, from a policy perspective, your 2 or 3 real innovation that this report is bringing, if you can tell us in a few words.
Thanks, Alexandre. Great to be with you, with Adriana, with Sarah, with Des, with Greg. Great pleasure to see good friends and to have this discussion. So let me, before going to your question, Alexandra, just say a word about the motivation, and this piggybacks on how Des ended this presentation, because I think this what we are doing here should be seen as part of a continuum. And what triggers our work is this sense of unsettledness in people's lives that is manifested in many different ways. Angus Deaton used the expression that many people around the world are losing the narratives of their lives. So there's just a sense that the world is changing around us in many different ways. You may remember that in 2019, there was a wave of protests around the world. So our initial hypothesis here in our office was that this was related in part to inequalities, to a new series of inequalities that was emerging. And I remember having many good discussions with Sarah and be inspired by her own work on inequalities. And I think that's part of the answer, but I don't think it's the totality of the answer. And Alexandre, here I'm reminded of work that we did together, or that you did and that I contributed in a minor way in this important report, Pathways for Peace, that basically broke the assumption that with greater prosperity and economic progress, we would not need to worry about violent conflict. So over the course of the 20th century, we've seen that even in countries with relatively high levels of income, violent conflict could break out, and that has been confirmed with the tragedy currently unfolding in the Ukraine. So our assumption was that certainly inequalities have something to do, but let's look at the concept of human security. It's a rich concept, it's a useful approach, and that's what motivated this special report. So what are the innovations that this report brings about? I would highlight three, and I'll just mention them briefly, and then during the discussion, maybe we can dig a little bit deeper. I think the first innovation is that it provides an empirical foundation and data to test this hypothesis that people are really feeling uncertain about the future and that are not feeling secure about many aspects of their life. And in fact, we constructed an index that suggests that 6 out of every 7 people around the world are feeling insecure about many aspects of their life. And these results happen even before the outbreak of COVID-19 and obviously before the war in the Ukraine. So it's probably been even heightened as a result of this latest set of shocks. Moreover, the perception of insecurity was increasing by most in some of the countries with the highest level of the Human Development Index. So this idea that just because countries achieve very high levels of income, health, and education, this would imply that people will feel secure is not borne out by the data. And furthermore, we found that there was a very strong association between people feeling insecure. This is at the micro level, so at the individual level, and people not trusting in one another. So there's a strong connection between insecurity and lack of trust. So I would say that this is the first innovation that the report puts forward, with much data that hopefully will be explored by others. And as Des said, we continue to look into in the ongoing Human Development Report under preparation. I think the second innovation, and again, this builds on some of the thinking that we've been doing in the report, is to try to provide an interpretation that links, that is linked to the interaction between inequalities on the one side and this new reality of dangerous planetary change that sometimes is described under the framing of the Anthropocene. There's a lot of attention certainly on climate change, with COVID-19 a little bit on the dangers of zoonotic diseases, but these are all manifestations of broader process of dangerous planetary change that are intersecting in inequalities in ways that are yielding a set of novel challenges that really have little precedent in human history. So we try to provide an interpretation about the causes or drivers, potential causes and drivers of the perception of insecurity that many people report having. And then the third innovation, and I will stop here because I know that we want to discuss this in a little bit more depth, is to suggest what to do going forward. There are two central ideas. One is that it's important to reaffirm the importance of empowering and protecting individuals, very much building on the notion of the 2003 Sadako Ogata and Amartya Sen Human Security Now report, which was the main finding. But we argue that it's important to have this added dimension of solidarity. And I'll just leave it at that for now, and then we can discuss it a little bit.
We'll discuss it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the second aspect that it's important to emphasize, I mean, this is not new as such, but that we suggest that it's important to give much more attention to is this idea of agency. As Amartya Sen said, looking at people, not patients, as subjects of interventions, of transfers, cash transfers, of important though all of that is, but also recognizing in people the ability to hold commitments or hold values and make commitments to things that can change and that can lead us to make different choices. So recognizing and finding ways of enhancing people's agency was the second extension that we proposed in this report. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was a great way to present us the direction, and I really like some of the issue you brought up. This thing that you know, insecurity now touches, in some ways, the anxiety of insecurity touches really all level of income is, I think, very, very important, because it explains a lot, I think, the real problems we're having also in very developed countries in terms of lack of trust, institution. And the work you've done on connecting this lack of security with lack of trust, I think, is very powerful. And it explains a lot why the crisis of institution is happening in poor countries, obviously, but there's a lack of trust in how people believe in institution that is very strong in very developed countries. So I think we have a crisis that is not anymore the crisis of poverty, but we have a global crisis. Of course, climate change touches everyone, even if the poorest have more difficulty to cope. You know, there was a Branko Milanovic, you know, he's the specialist of inequality. He did a tweet recently that I found quite interesting. He said, you know, the more countries are sophisticated, the more they're dependent on others, and the more they have a problem of resilience, because they're so interdependent from everyone that actually the risks of anything happening somewhere is much worse on them than a country that are relatively isolated. And that's something relatively new, right? That we're not, and we have seen it with the pandemic, and we have seen it with the war in Ukraine so strongly. So anyway, I'm not supposed to talk too much there. I'm supposed to moderate. So I'm going to go to another one of our other speakers who's worked a lot on this connection between different elements of human security, and this is Dr. Adriana Denure. And I would like for you to tell us a little bit on your own vision of this concept of human security from the perspective of all the very interesting work you've done on the connection between violence and climate change in particular, and how two elements, the violence and climate change, are interrelated. But how do you take in your own analysis this concept of human security?
Thank you very much, Alexandre. It's a pleasure to be here in this distinguished panel. I'm director of a think tank here in Brazil, and we work very locally, especially in the Amazon, but we also take part in some of these global debates about norm setting. And this will not be unfamiliar to you, certainly to Pedro. What we notice from our perch in these topics is that there's this very strong tension with respect to the United Nations. So on the one hand, there's clearly a need to overcome the so-called silos, given that challenges like climate change are so cross-cutting. And on the other hand, we know that UN politics and resources are traditionally very much tied to the pillars or the silos. And they are the object of political and even geopolitical disputes. So that every time that you try to overstep the traditional boundaries of the pillars, there's sometimes, a bit of a knee-jerk fear of contamination. There's a lot of territorialism, but there is also some very valid concerns over power and over resources. And this is particularly the case whenever you bring in security to another pillar, right? Whether it's development or it's environment and climate, that should be a pillar. And so the issue is not whether we should think about those overlaps, because it's inevitable if we accept that, for instance, climate change is a cross-cutting issue, but it's how we do it, how it's framed, and how ultimately that has consequences, including unanticipated consequences for people on the ground. So we see this very much in the so-called climate and security agenda, which, as you know, has gained steam, especially over the last 5 years or so. And even though there was a UN Security Council resolution put forth and that was vetoed, there was geopolitics involved, but I think it's also valid to see, what are the concerns that have been brought up in this particular agenda, and also what direction it has moved since that veto. And I would say that the direction it's moved in is very relevant to our discussion today. It's taking it away from the spotlight of the Security Council and thinking more about what is the role of climate and security within development, within peace building, within humanitarian, and within the climate spaces more traditionally built. And here's, I think, where the usefulness of human security comes in from this particular angle. The recognition that climate can, in some contexts, magnify security risks. It occurs through undermining human security, whether we're talking about food, water, energy security, that in some circumstances can lead to intensified disputes over natural resources, especially when they're scarce, and especially when there's low capacity by the state and other relevant actors to prevent and to respond. And so if we think in terms of that lens, not necessarily going straight into armed conflict, into violent extremism in the first place, this really corresponds to communities' lived experience, perceptions, and concerns with the ways that climate is really affecting their day-to-day life, whether it's causing, malnutrition, it's causing, lack of access, increased lack of access to energy, or enhanced migration, right? And most of this climate-influenced migratory patterns that we're seeing, for instance, here in Latin America, they're within countries, they're not across international borders. That particular debate gets a lot of misrepresentation. And so we find that, and I'll be happy to go into more detail, focusing on human security is very important for ratcheting down the level of these debates, which have taken place, especially when you look at the Security Council, at very high aggregate levels of analysis and decision-making. It's regions, it's the global level, sometimes it's particular countries. But if we're thinking about communities and people, then we have to think about localizing these particular debates. And, picking up on what Des has already mentioned, at CIPÓ, we've partnered with GPAC and with some support from UNDP to think about these issues very locally. And one of the main instruments where I think human security comes in a very concrete but very productive way is, for instance, by coming up with risk assessments that are community-led and that capture not only security situation, but also how specifically and concretely climate is undermining human security at that particular level. So that decision-making at all levels, not just local, but subnational, national, regional, and global, really are grounded in these lived experiences. We're producing a guidance note that is a product of South-South cooperation, which we're very proud of that particular angle. And it's currently being tested by our partners in Uganda, Zimbabwe, maybe next month in Mozambique. And we're gathering inputs for that in order to revise this guidance note. This is just one example of how, we can concretely incorporate. But again, coming back to the political angle, and now I'll close my remarks, the concerns are that these local experiences are taken into account so that we don't have these abstract and sometimes very geopolitical takes on the intersection between the pillars, but also in terms of resources. So there is real and I think very valid concern that introducing new intersections will lead for resources to be diverted away from areas that have historically needed them very much, where rich countries have made commitments and are already far behind. So, climate and security, will this divert resources away from development, traditionally rich? Will it divert resources away from climate? And we all know here that commitments that are constantly being made, are subject to these massive lags with respect to the rich countries' commitments in particular. So again, it's not whether we should look at the intersections, that's inevitable, but it's how. And I think the way that human security is framed, but then operationalized through and across the silos, really, it's not just a political issue. It has very concrete consequences, including for the communities that we work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It reminds me when we were working on violence a long time ago in Central America, and I remember at that time there was this school improvement program that our colleagues from education wanted to do, and very quickly in the survey we remarked that the problem with schooling was actually getting the girls securely to the school, or was all the problem of floods that were flooding the school all the time. So the problem of insecurity in education was actually linked to other problems that were related to other forms of the human security. This is very powerful. This is what you're saying. I think how all these things get very connected and how it's impossible to pursue clean sectoral policies today. You have to work in a much more global way. Thank you very much. So I want to go into another topic now that was raised very, very prominently by the report of UNDP, and is a problem that affects us all in our own security, and that we talked about it both in terms of high-level wars, sophisticated wars like the one fought in Ukraine at the moment, but also much more at the local level, and this is the problem of cybersecurity. So we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Greg Austin. And I would like, Greg, if you could talk about the cyber insecurity and how today it becomes a full component of human security. Just tell us a few words about that, please.
Yes, thanks, Alexandra. Hello, everyone. So I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., the capital of the cyber surveillance world, I suppose you might say, the capital of the cyber development world. I think that it's gratifying to see that the UNDP report lists digital threats as the first of 4 when it goes through in its report. It mentions important areas like human rights and harms on social media, artificial intelligence threats to human security, and the digital divide. I'd like to add to that sets of characterization, or that set of characterizations, with the proposition that we can best understand the impact on human security of cyberspace and cyber technologies by 3 words: opportunity, threat, and dependency. And so people on the call will be very familiar with the threats, but it's important to remember the opportunity represented by digital technologies. And the United Nations system began to develop a keen interest in this beginning in 1998 with UN General Assembly resolutions on ICT and development. But that line of argument and discussion was not as strong and as powerful as the line of discussion on ICT and international security. But the good news is that the UN system invented this remarkable institution called the World Summit on Information Society, which is largely ignored in international relations literature. Most policy people I meet don't know anything about it, but it's a very rich and vibrant contribution to international development and to human security. So opportunity is a fundamental element of what ICT brings, and new technologies, including, for example, 6G, imagined in the 2030s to be able to provide things like remote surgery by robots to countries in the world and localities in the world that don't have any hospitals or any doctors. You just have the robot, you connect it up to some doctors in another country, and the robot does the surgery. So opportunity is a fundamental aspect of the digital reality that we live. Everyone will be familiar with the threats. So I won't I could just list off a few, I suppose, just to remind ourselves. So we've got the threat of crime, the threat of child pornography, other attacks on young people, threats to privacy, and the social media radicalization, trafficking, and terrorism, which are all enabled by cyber technologies, as is war itself. But interestingly, as Alexandra mentioned, the Ukraine war has brought home to us both the potential of defense in cyberspace and the potential of international solidarity of classic conventional war threats. But let me talk a little bit about dependency. And I think this has been a theme in a couple of the sets of remarks so far. Cyberspace changed the world. Digital technologies have changed the world. They have made us all dependent on each other in new ways. And they've made us, well, they've transformed our social reality. This has been borne out in the Ukraine war. So for example, leading corporations such as Microsoft came to the defense of Ukraine in cyberspace, conducted large numbers of cyber defense operations, and in all sorts of ways, international IT corporations are changing the balance of political power in the Ukraine conflict. The decline in the Russian ICT sector since the war has been profound. 84 leading ICT companies from outside the world, outside Russia, have withdrawn, and the Russian ICT sector is heading for disaster. So it's interesting to look at some of those figures. But let me return to opportunity. Of the list of threats in the chapters in the UND report, the only one which offers significant empowerment and significant opportunity to redress the various ills that chapter not only addresses, but the other chapters. And that is this question of empowerment. So all of the other 3 chapters, violent conflict, inequality, and health problems, are all more addressable and more subject to amelioration because of ICT. And this is really profound. It's important for the global system, the global security system, the global security agencies to mobilize ICT and ICT capabilities for good in ways that address these problems. And we see lots of signs that it's happening. So I'm not saying it's not happening, but I think that it's gratifying to see the UNDP put digital first in the list of 4 threats. But digital is very empowering, but it brings with us this change in structural order of dependency. So let me just stop there and reiterate the 3 themes opportunity, threat, and dependency. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. This was an excellent presentation on this issue. Indeed, this is something that we're living more, I think, every day. You know, everyone is living with this impact of the technology in their own life. And it's always very, when you have a new technology that has so much good and also so much bad, you're struggling actually with transition of how you start to adopt a technology that you can use in a way, and like atomic energy that has also, we forgot too often, a lot of very positive aspects in medicine and many things. And we were, you know, and when we discovered after that, when Marie Curie, I think, found atomic energy, she was only thinking about curative aspects, right? And then the atomic bomb was invented just after. So you have this problem of how you adapt to those new instruments. And meanwhile, it's part of the overall concept of human security. But thank you for your very clear presentation of that. So I think Sarah Cliffe has now joined us. And Sarah, who's also a very good friend, was actually the director of the WDR 2011. And through all her career, she's always worked with policymakers. Basically, that was her main task, right? Whether at the World Bank or at the UN or in the work she's doing now, trying to bring different countries, country level policymaker together. So I want to ask Sarah a little bit how this concept of human security is worked by the policymaking communities, especially in developing countries where you've been doing so much work. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that, that would be great. Sarah, the floor is yours. Hello? Oh. I've heard that you had joined us. Do we have a problem with connection with Sarah? Because I just received a message that she was online.
Yeah, we can see her, but not hear her.
Ah, Sarah, you have, I don't know, there's a problem with your, because I see you're on, but I don't hear you. So maybe we'll take a few minutes to try to fix that, and maybe you can come back in the second phase on this question, in the second phase of our discussions. Anyway, we are at the 45 minutes. So I don't know who can, I don't know if I just received a message, the Royan Tom, that she seems to be muted from the outside.
Yes, we'll try and message her privately now.
Oh, okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. So as soon as she's ready, let me know, and then I will bring her in. So we have I wanted to go now a little bit more in the concepts of solidarity, because that's something that you bring very strongly in the report. And I've seen a lot of discussion of your report. And I think there's a question that comes very centrally is yes. When you read the report and when you hear all our intervenants, you realize that solidarity is what we need, right? Solidarity inside community, but much broader solidarity. For cybersecurity, it's really solidarity between countries. For many issues around violence is also, but also security at the community level. So this problem of solidarity, we're in a world where solidarity is also put into question more and more, or we have doubt about how solidarity we move, because we have more and more, on one side, more and more individualist behavior at the local level, in many society, and all the network of solidarity are falling apart. We have this greatly documented work by Putnam in the United States that shows that human capital is actually very much at risk today. People collaborate less, are less solidary in many things. But at the same time, it seems that it's a central concept. So I wanted to discuss that a little bit. And maybe I will ask again to Pedro if he can come back and tell us, go a little bit more in depth about this problem of solidarity, and especially how do you deal with solidarity when solidarity itself seems to be at threat today?
Thanks, Alexandra. Let me comment first on the notion of solidarity as being associated with the social capital that you just highlighted. Solidarity, we suggest in the report, should be understood, or the way in which we mean to propose as an important idea, is really not solidarity within a group. Because one of the challenges we confront is that if you have a lot of solidarity, a lot of trust, a lot of capital only within different groups, but across groups, you actually have hostility, that becomes a problem. So I think this is the first important point to emphasize, is to define what we mean by solidarity. And there are essentially two reasons why we argue it is crucial today. One is that this notion of comprehensive solidarity, if you want, is something that cannot be avoided in the context of dangerous planetary change. And that's why the link with the notion of the Anthropocene is so important. It's not only that our societies are interconnected and interdependent, and particularly have become more so after the 1980s, 1990s, when there was a greater integration of our economies, finance, goods and services through trade. So that led to reflections on UNDP, actually led many of these thinking around the provision of global public goods. So that's a notion that speaks to our interdependence as a global community. But what the notion of the Anthropocene brings that's new is that it's not only our interdependence at the society level, if you will, is that we are now affecting processes at the biophysical level of our planet. And even if you could conceive a world in which all borders were to be closed, nature has no borders. So this process of global planetary change would still be there. So it's something that in the limit it's really unavoidable for us to have this notion of solidarity that brings about a realization of our dependence on our planet and the damages that can occur, or threats that can occur as a result of this dangerous planetary change. So this is the first reason. And then there's a second reason. There's a lot of emphasis and discussion currently on the idea of social contracts and improving on social contracts, which is certainly very, very important. But the social contract is always a contract that is struck between a community and an entity that is that has authority over that community, with relationships of trust, accountability, and that's certainly very important. But we argue that in this global context, in this planetary reality, it's useful to consider that a social contract may suffer from two shortcomings. One is that if it's struck only at the level of the community, may not account for spillovers. So what this social contract may have implications with what happens elsewhere. And secondly, is also not necessarily considering the views of communities that are elsewhere. So this is another reason why this notion of solidarity is important. And we emphasize in the report that solidarity, in the meaning that we want to suggest, is not something that should be seen as optional charity, or something that subsumes the importance of individual rights to the interests of a collective. Is really a call to understand our interdependence with one another, but our interdependence with the planet.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was a great clarification. And I think now I will, because I think Sarah now is on the mic, so I will bring her back into the discussion now. and maybe actually already move her to the next question, which is really about this issue of human security for policymakers, but seems from this perspective of increasing solidarity in the way Pedro has just described it, which I think is much clearer than what I had myself in terms of concepts of solidarity in my mind. Can you, Sarah, are you on?
Yes, do you hear me now, Alexander?
Yes. We see you.
Very good. So thank you so much to you and to IISS for this discussion. I really enjoyed listening to Des, to Pedro, to Adriana, and to Greg. Let me just comment quickly on the question that you were first asking on how have we seen human security affect policymakers at country level, and then I'll relate to the solidarity issues that Pedro just raised. I think 3 quick examples of how effective a concept this has been in really changing practice at a very, very country, very contextual level. One is with relationship to displaced people. So if we see the situation, for instance, around Syria with the large number of refugees and displaced people from the Syrian conflict, provoked a realization among humanitarians that we had incredibly long periods of displacement, average period of displacement of 17 years, and that the narrow way in which we had been thinking of security for refugees and displaced people, which was about saving lives and feeding them, essentially, making sure that their absolute lowest rung of needs was catered for. This was totally inappropriate to a length of displacement, which could be a child being born in a refugee camp and growing up to adulthood in that camp. So all the changes that we've seen in subsequent years in countries such as Jordan and Lebanon, but as far away as Chad, of trying to integrate displaced children, for example, into education systems, trying to make sure that they have better job opportunities. That, I think, comes about through the concept of an interconnected and broader sense of human security. Second example would be in Colombia, where the Colombian government for many years used the concept of citizen security. There was some controversy over this. There were some critiques of whether that was still too security-driven an approach. But what it achieved in very practical terms is that they reorganized their government services in areas that were among the poorest, most conflict affected and most peripheral to the state, so that justice services, police services and social services were working together. So a very practical example of that sort of interconnectedness again. And a third for me came through a trip that I took to DRC in February of this year, where I actually was very surprised to see the extent to which large development programs had been adapted to take a broad sense of security and welfare into account. So road programs, for instance, that were also addressing gender-based violence and mechanisms of redress for gender-based violence, education programs that were addressing violence in the community as part of school curriculum. So really a shift in the way that a lot of development practitioners are thinking about designing programs. And that, I think, is a very practical thing. I'll just comment very quickly on the solidarity issues that Pedro raised, that I couldn't agree more. So I think it is absolutely crucial to have that global level that addresses dangerous planetary change and that addresses the actions that are needed to deal with things that within a country, citizens and their state cannot deal with. So it's like a global level of the social contract that is really necessary if social contracts at national level are going to work. The problem and the challenge, I think, now is that we had 2 years of repeated crises, which should have spurred that sense of solidarity. So if I understand Pedro, it's a sense of solidarity that is very much rooted in realism and in pragmatism, that we need this if we are going to survive through the uncertainties of this century. And yet the shock of COVID-19, the shock of the economic and social displacement and tensions that came afterwards, and now the shock of the Ukraine war, have not produced as much policy action as I think many of us would have hoped we might see as a result of that very clear message. that we cannot deal with these situations country by country. We need that level of global solidarity. So it's perhaps a discussion for the other panelists also to give their views. Back to you, Alexandre.
Yes, thank you very much. In all the examples you were giving, I want to come back maybe by question to Adriana, because she's done so much work in the field also with communities, and want to come with a group that, and you mentioned it with gender-based violence, but you know, and the report says it also, you know, women today in their taking more responsibility, getting more involved, they also sort of, there are specific risks that come out, right? So I'd like Adriana to tell us a little bit how she sees this element of security dealing with the sort of more specific gender-based security, I mean, the woman's security. Would you be at ease to tell us a little bit about that, Adriana? I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot because that's unprepared questions.
No, that's fine, Alexandre. I mean, you know, we women usually get the gender questions, right? So I'd like to say two things. With respect to gender, you know, I'm here in Brazil, and our region has undergone immense backsliding on women's rights. We have soaring rates of femicide and violent attacks on women, or more broadly, gender-based violence, including of the domestic type. There's been backsliding in terms of women's participation in politics. We get extreme right discourses that are now being mainstreamed that restrict women's rights, including with respect to reproductive rights. So it's a very concerning panorama that is obviously intricately linked to security, not in terms of lives only, but you know, access to resources, access to well-being, and even access to maybe what we should call, you know, channels of solidarity. I mean, I think we're really living through here an era of backsliding in solidarity at the local, but also at the local level, but also in terms of international cooperation. I have more to say on this issue of solidarity, so let me kick it up a notch. It's really interesting to see this discourse being adopted, and I congratulate Pedro and his colleagues at UNDP, because South-South cooperation, of course, has long resorted to the language of solidarity, but we've always been critical in civil society of the way it's been mobilized, because it's been a very heavy focus on state-to-state solidarity and not necessarily society-to-society solidarity, even within South-South relations. It's also been used in a sort of, if not oppositional tone, and then at least in a sense that, you know, aid has left major gaps and kicked away some ladders, so we need to band together to find our own solutions. And I think it is very valuable to think of solidarity more broadly writ than in that particular sense. But obviously, it's not enough just to call for solidarity. You have to create and strengthen concrete channels and really alter the structure of incentives, not just appeal to people's goodwill, because as we know from digital challenges, that's being undermined at the individual level, that's undercutting social fabric and even international cooperation. And I think that you have to operationalize it in a horizontal sense, you know, with respect to cooperation, but also maybe we can speak of a vertical solidarity where you have to imbue bureaucracies such as the UN system top down also with solidarity, and that doesn't always happen, as we know. I think meaningful participation by civil society, not just in decision making, but also knowledge production, is a necessary part of operationalizing solidarity. And that happens not very frequently. There are massive gaps in resources and other capacities for knowledge production that feed into the policy process. That's especially true not only of women's groups or organizations such as ours, but also indigenous and traditional communities, and the way they're incorporated usually is through token attention. So again, you know, building concrete channels, whether we're talking about gender or we're talking about other aspects of social exclusion, that has to be thought in very concrete and even political channels. And I won't go into more detail here because of lack of time, but I think the emerging discussion on just transition is a very strategic place so that we can ensure that it's not just about rich countries finally realizing that structural transformation is needed, something that we have been calling for decades, if not centuries, but also ensuring that no green ladders are kicked away, to quote my good friend at Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We heard a lot in all these discussions that are actually really, I think, are very thought-provoking. We hear a lot about cyber, of course, and about when people think today about the difficulty of solidarity, you think about how competition between big firms and competition between nations are at the extreme, and all of them have a big use of cyber tools for that. So how, I wanted to ask to Greg Austin how he sees solidarity in this field of cyber practically developing.
Well, thanks, Alexandra. If I could channel Luciano Floridi, a moral philosopher of the information age, formerly at Oxford and now working in Italy. It's really about aggregation, disaggregation, and reaggregation. And I think we can understand solidarity in the modern world as fragmenting and being reconstituted. So we can really think about fragmented solidarities. And so we see the polarization that's occurring in certain countries. The polarization goes global, and international relationships and reform agendas, activist agendas are refashioned in the wake of these fragmenting solidarities. And for the situation that Adriana was just discussing, or the reversal of women's rights and social opportunities and security in Brazil, that solidarity that's able to be built through cyberspace internationally becomes very, very important. I think the other thing worth noting is that the big ICT firms have become important sources of philanthropy for the development community. Some of them pursue their own obscure developmental agendas, but we have this new class of actor in the developmental community. Bill Gates is one representative, I suppose, but there's so much happening at the sort of undocumented level, really, in terms of the way in which these big ICT corporations affect social solidarity at all levels. So let me just summarize really by saying, solidarity is under threat. Solidarity can be rebuilt, reconstructed, reaggregated, and these reaggregations will redefine the future world. And I'm not sure that we know fully yet, for example, how the deep polarization we see in some countries, deepening polarization, whether it's Brazil, the United States, or Australia, for example, just where, in a sense, the highest forms of solidarity will rest. What will be their resting place? Thanks.
Yeah, that's this concepts of polarization, I think, comes today in all what we are discussing on the big global side. I'd like to bring Pedro a little bit more in now on how do you respond to this issue about this fragmentation of solidarity and this polarization that we see everywhere, facing your concept that you've developed in your report.
I think this is more something we are exploring, and we'll put some ideas forward in the next HDR, Alexandra. But to give you the general sense, and it relates and builds on what we've been discussing here in the context of human security. I mean, to put it very simply, it's about a disconnect or a mismatch between a set of novel, unprecedented changes that are happening, the Anthropocene reality, also this aspiration to transition, as Adriana emphasized. The transition that we're talking about here is not structural transformation in the traditional sense of moving from agriculture to industry, from industry to services. It's about something that is going to be as consequential as the transition from agriculture to industrial societies. That's what's at stake here. This is very tough to do. This is very unsettling. This is about reorganizing our economies, reorganizing our societies in fairly fundamental ways. And Greg is right. Digital is a very important part of the story with a mix of opportunity and threats. And this can be extended to other technologies, from gene editing to many other technologies. But so the broader context is one in which there is this mismatch between the challenges that we are confronting and how we are equipped to deal with them at three different levels. So Adriana mentioned the importance of looking at incentives or interests, I would say. Of course, that remains central. But it's important also to recognize the power of ideas potentially to move societies towards something else. So I don't think it's either or. It's not only interest, it's not only ideas, it's both. And also recognizing perhaps that the current institutions that we currently rely on at different levels are not giving sufficient response to the challenges that we're confronting. Many of the institutions that we now take for granted emerged in the context of the transition to industrial societies, from joint stock companies to the way in which we organize our politics. And if the premise that things around us are changing in very fundamental ways and we want them to change even more, then that may call for new institutions, new arrangements, new social arrangements. And so I don't think it's surprising at all that we find unsettledness and some people trying to behave and hold on to what they think makes them secure, and others taking the opposite view and taking very different views on the radical transformations that are needed.
Thank you very much. So I just want to call the participant to raise their hand if they want to jump in the discussion. This is really the discussion part of our session now. We're getting towards the end. But I want to ask to Dr. Des Gasper, who's looked at things from more of an academic point of view in terms of those things, how this, what Pedro was talking about this sort of rebuilding it from rebuilding this element of solidarity from a very, very different perspective. What's your thought about this? Because you thought about those concepts so much.
Thank you, Alexandre. I was thinking about Sarah Cliffe's remarks on how, while we expect that big changes come in response to big crises, that's the moment of fluidity. What we've seen in the last 2 or more years in big global crises has been quite a lot of local level, national level, and in some cases regional level solidarity, but very little global and planetary solidarity, which is disturbing. And we can sort of understand how the sorts of challenges that people face reinforce local and national identity, solidarity as their hope, their solace, their frame of meaning. Apparently more for most people than planetary reference. That's a big step, and that takes time. That's not something that will happen in 2 or 3 years. Human security thinking is, I think we should see it both as a research agenda and as a policy agenda. And the research agenda, which this special report spells out on sources of felt insecurity, is fundamentally important and needs to be invested in, persisted in, and then connected to it will help support a more robust policy agenda. Second thought, though, is just this week I was by chance in the French city of Lille, which is a major city in northern France, in an area of historic industrial decline, and trying to launch and reprofile itself. And I didn't know, but I encountered a huge festival called Utopia, Lille 3000, going on for 5 months, reconceiving the globe, reconceiving human life within the globe, here in this supposedly depressed corner of northern France, and as part of networks of, yes, not interstate, but inter-municipality, inter-civil society, etc., interaction and cooperation and creation. A huge amount of that going on. One hopes that that will be the seedbed for long-term changes, because unfortunately the big steps that are needed are not ones that will come as a short-term response to current crises.
Yeah, yeah, that was very powerful. I'm very happy that the French keeps their cutting edge on revolutions and revolutionary ideas. I thought they had lost it a bit. I'm French myself, so I'm happy of that. I've heard a bit about that, but now I'm very intrigued. I think I'm going to take a trip to Lille once I'm here.
Yeah, I recommend.
Sorry? Yeah.
Yes, I recommend that.
Yes, but I want to, the problem I see is this time problem we have. So everybody says, you know, it will take time. We're at such a level of redefining everything. Things will settle, hopefully, but we have relatively little time before we do damage to our planet that will be irreversible, or damage to our social structure that will be irreversible. You know, Sarah, would you like to come on that? Because you have such a bird eye view, having been, you know, UN, World Bank and all that, from those things. That we'd be very interested to get your views on that. Hello? It seems Sarah has a... Hello, Sarah? She seems to have a new issues on that. So maybe I will take the question back to Adriana again from a very broad perspective. You already gave us a certain broad perspective about things, but now not from your community level, but from the broader level.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, your question is, how do we postpone the end of the world?
That's right. Exactly. It's how do we build up? How do we give us enough time to build up solidarity and that the world does not collapse in between?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. Very difficult to answer. But I think that, you know, as I mentioned, this idea of just transition to me is really interesting, and it's riddled with potential minds, because the way that I see this debate taking place is it's very much led right now by the global north. In general, rich countries have a view of just transition that focus on a sort of techno-economic set of changes based on energy transition. This doesn't always correspond to the needs, the perceptions, and the desires of global south countries. And obviously there's massive diversity there, but I have two concerns. One is that in developing countries, addressing this intersection between development and climate really has to focus first and foremost on social issues. If you lose a job due to green transition in the north, you're losing one formal job. In countries like mine, you know, where vast informality characterizes labor markets, you're talking about undermining the human security of 12, 15 people, of multiple households. Labor unions are much more fragmented. The context is so different. And sometimes, as in the case of Brazil, energy transition is not the biggest problem. It actually has to do with these structural transformations that are taking place at the global level and having unintended consequences, whether through automation or through transition away from fossil fuels. So I think this is a very powerful space for thinking about human security, but there has to be a stronger conversation about what it means for and by developing countries. And also, I'm very concerned about the transnational impacts of just transition in places like the European Union, the UK, the United States, because I think it's the transitions being thought primarily in terms of those national or regional borders, whereas we know that the consequences overseas will be vast. So we have to anticipate the dark side of sustainability as well, and then anticipate accordingly in the planning and approaches and preventive measures that can be implemented in the global south. And I think if we do that, then yes, we can have a set of structural transformations that will allow us to postpone the end of the world. By the way, here I'm borrowing Ailton Krenak, an indigenous author here in Brazil, who's written a book called Postponing, Ideas for Postponing the End of the World. So I think just transition, if we get it right, Pedro, is a way to implement solidarity at the national, but also international level. And it's an opportunity that has to be seized right now. Thank you.
I think the next Human Development Report should have this title.
That's a
great title, Pedro. But
we will take it, Alexandra. Thank you and Adriana.
There's a dimension still of this which is really the dimension of power and governance, which is global governance and power today that I found very frightening, right? So how it's difficult to bring those real power, and how much competition, but competition to a level that is worrying, right? In terms of it becomes like very existential. It seems that it's very existential culturally, like, you know, the position of Russia on the rest of the world, position on China, the position of certain segment in the American society on those things. It's very, I would say, existential, which means it pushed this question of power to the limit. And I wanted to hear a little bit more also, again, from Greg on that, because you, in your work, you see those aspects of the big picture very closely, I imagine.
Well, thanks, Alexandra. Very tough question. The concentration of power away from governments, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon. So the incredible wealth that we see generated in some countries has enabled a degree of political influence that we never really saw on the same sort of scale as we have seen. So, for example, if you just take the United States as an example, and you understand how money plays in politics of the United States and how transformational that has been in the polarization of the country. So and if you sort of understand the incredible wealth of the ICT corporations and the energy companies, I think that, you know, it may sound like an old agenda. I know people on the call have written on sort of the power of the multinational corporations over decades, but I think it's fundamentally different, and the contestation between new centers of power, I think, is profound. It's contributing to the polarization. I don't think international order will settle anytime soon. You know, China is in a very complex situation, struggling with all sorts of policy responses to very difficult problems. And, you know, India, in a sense, in its transformations, Brazil, yeah, I just see high levels of contestation. I see them driven by incredible amounts of wealth that have accumulated in part because of the ICT revolution. I mean, imagine the impact on wealth of the digital trading in currencies alone that we see. The volume of currency trading on any given day in the world is in the order of trillions of dollars. So that information for the the relevant international organizations is staggering. So for all of those financial transfers, there's wealth creation of trillions of dollars per day. And so that wealth creation has an inevitable political impact. So let me stop there. I think I've given a bit of the flavor of how I think about it. It'd be interesting to hear others view it. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we're getting to the end of our extremely, at least that I found extremely interesting and stimulating discussion. It opened, I think, more areas for exploration than it closed anything. But I would like to give the last word to Pedro about what does he take of this discussion and what does it take for the further thinking on human security.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I would like you to actually take the last word because you haven't shared your thoughts. So I'll be brief and throw the question back at you. Well, first of all, thank all the colleagues that participated. I always say that the reports that we produce are not ends in themselves. They are really excuses for people like us to get together, to discuss with policymakers, with the public at large, to stimulate colleagues in academia to think and deepen some of the questions and hypotheses that we put forward. So I think that's the spirit of what brought us together, and hopefully this will continue. But related to the point that we're discussing, I'm reminded of this cri de coeur of the Gilets jaunes, Alexandre, you may remember.
Yes,
and
yes.
when they said that you're telling me about the end of the world and I'm trying to make it until the end of the week. So I think this corresponds a little bit to the unsettledness that we confront, and it's really about how to make the two come together in a way. I mean, that's the question that animated a lot of the discussion today, and we will continue to explore as we forward. Thank you.
Maybe for closing, thank you very much. I think this report brings a lot of issues for discussion. It's a very stimulating report, and I think that the topic is extremely stimulating. I think the problem we have in those type of periods, and humanity have known other part of periods like that, where we know solidarity is an answer, we know better collaboration is an answer, but we see also in a lot of grounds things going the other way, is when people lose trust, when people lose hope, they tend to then throw what we can call the baby and the bath. And that's a bit what you're saying. They're starting to say, well, maybe democracy is not what we need. Maybe, we were better 100 years ago, we were better 50 years ago. And all this is a very, very risky and dangerous type of thinking. And before it was, countries that were poor, that wouldn't trust their government, that would find issues of governance. Today, as with human security that touches everywhere, it's the whole world that is like that. So I don't think I have much to add about all the debate about the fact that I think there's a lot of urgent thinking to do, and a lot of urgent thinking on how we bring those people that populists only reflect a lot of the view of those people, insecure, much more individualist, trying to go on their own. How you bring them back into something that is a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more, as people say, the fraternité from the French liberté, égalité, fraternité. We've done a lot of égalité, we've done a lot of liberté, but we haven't done enough on fraternité. And if fraternité is about solidarity. So if I can, on these big words, close this webinar, which I think was very, very stimulating, at least for me. Thank very much all the ones who were there listening to us. Thanks very much all the participants. And we're already looking for the next step of the reflections of the UN on those topics. Thank you very much.